Our presentation is entitled, Babylon is Alive and Well. That's the study guide. And then also, God has a church on earth. No kidding. Now, last evening, we spent some time looking at Babylon, and we're going to spend some more time in Revelation chapter 17. But the first passage of Scripture I'd like to take you to is actually in Ezekiel chapter 9. Ezekiel chapter 9. Let's go there together. We'll probably begin in chapter 8 to sort of set the context for chapter 9. So you can find Ezekiel. That's the book just before Daniel. We're going to Ezekiel, and we'll start in chapter 8. Ezekiel chapter 8. And this is going to help us to understand the seriousness and the urgency of the commingling of truth and error. The seriousness and the urgency of the commingling of that which is true and biblical with that which is not true and is unbiblical. So I'm in Ezekiel chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. And here in Ezekiel chapter 8, we find the prophet Ezekiel receiving a tour de force of the abominations and error that had crept in, even to Israel. And we're going to sort of take this tour with Ezekiel. It's really kind of fascinating how the tour takes place. God takes Ezekiel by a lock of his hair and in prophetic vision lifts him up by his hair and actually starts taking him around on, as we've said, a tour de force of all of the abominations that were taking place. And the abominations get subsequently worse and worse and worse and worse. So let's pick that up in Ezekiel chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. And it came to pass in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I sat in my house with the elders of Judah sitting before me, that the hand of the Lord fell upon me there. Then I looked, and there was a likeness, behold, like the likeness of fire, from the appearance of his waist downward, fire. From his waist upward, like the appearance of brightness, like the color of amber. Here he's seeing God in vision. Verse 3. He stretched out the form of a hand, and he took me by a lock of my hair, and the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the north gate of the inner court, where the seat of the image of jealousy was, which provokes to jealousy. Verse 4. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, like the vision that I saw in the plain. Then he said to me, Son of man, lift up your eyes now toward the north. So I lifted up my eyes toward the north, and there, north of the altar gate, was this image of jealousy in the entrance. That is to say, right in the very entrance of the temple of God, there was an idol that had been set up. Verse 6. Furthermore, he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The great abominations that the house of Israel commits here, to make me go far away from my sanctuary? Now turn again, and you will see greater abominations. And so God here takes Ezekiel and he brings him right to the gate of the temple, the entrance of the temple, and sitting there was an altar, an image to a pagan god. And he says, do you see this? Do you see this image of jealousy right in the very entrance to my temple? And Ezekiel would have said, yes, I see that, Lord. And he says, I'll show you even greater abominations than these. Verse 7. So he brought me to the door of the court, and when I looked, there was a hole in the wall. And he said to me, Son of man, dig into the wall. And when I dug into the wall, there was a door. And he said to me, go in and see the wicked abominations which they are doing there. Now remember, this is in the temple. Not the temple, some pagan temple or the temple of Baal. This is the temple of God. Verse 10. So I went in and I saw there every sort of creeping thing, abominable beasts, and all idols of the house of Israel, portrayed all around on the walls. And there stood before them 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel, and in their midst stood Jehazaniah of the son of Shaphan. Each man had a censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. Then he said to me, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel do in the dark? Every man in the room of his idols, for they say, the Lord does not see us, the Lord has forsaken us. Verse 13, then he said to me, turn again, and you will see greater abominations than these that they are doing. And so he takes him from the image of jealousy, and now he brings him, he says, you see this hole in the temple wall? I see it. Dig into that hole, go in there, into the temple, and see what the priests are doing in darkness. And as Ezekiel, the prophet of the Lord, is sort of like a fly on the wall looking through the keyhole there, he sees that God's own priests, God's what, everyone? God's own priests were worshiping idols in an absolutely incredible way, right in the very temple, right in the very house of God. And I can just imagine in my mind's eye Ezekiel saying, I can't believe this. I can't believe that the professed people of God are worshiping these idols in the temple of God. But he said to him, you think this is bad? You'll see even worse abominations than these. I'm in verse 14. So he brought me to the door of the north gate of the Lord's house, and to my dismay, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. That's one of the fertility goddesses of paganism. Then he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Turn again and you will see greater abominations than these. Here were people weeping for this pagan goddess Tammuz. And you can just imagine God saying, do you see this, Ezekiel? These are my people. These aren't the heathen. These aren't the Gentiles. These aren't the pagans. These are my people. Do you see what they're doing? And I can just imagine Ezekiel saying, blah, 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 I see it, Lord, but I can hardly believe it. And he says, you'll see greater abominations even than these. Verse 16, so he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house. And there at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east. And they were worshiping the what? They were worshiping the sun toward the east. And he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Is it a trivial thing to the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence. Then they have returned to provoke me to anger. Indeed, they put the branch to their nose. That's kind of an unusual, ancient way of saying that they're basically snuffing at me. Disinterested in me. Verse 18, therefore I also will act in my fury. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them. When God is taking Ezekiel on this sort of tour de force of the abominations of Israel, he caps it off with the capstone. The most egregious violation was the worship of the sun in the very temple of God. At each subsequent stage, he said, you see this? I see this. You'll see worse. Do you see this? I see this. You'll see worse. Do you see this? I see it. You'll see worse. And as the capstone, as the crescendo, he brings them right into the very house of God, and they're worshiping the sun in the temple of God. Fascinating. If you go on to read then in Ezekiel chapter 9, it's very interesting. What happens in Ezekiel chapter 9 is people receive a mark. People receive a what, everyone? They receive a mark, and it's fascinating because that parallels exactly with the seal of God and the mark of the beast that we discover there in Revelation chapter 13. And those that didn't have God's mark, those that didn't have God's seal, were slain. Are we talking about serious things, or are we talking about unimportant things? Which one? Serious things, beloved. And so in Ezekiel chapter 8 and Ezekiel chapter 9, we saw the worship of the sun right in the very temple of God. We're talking about Babylon. And we learned yesterday that Babylon is the center of man-made worship. They built the Tower of Babel, and they said, come, let us build a tower up into the highest of the high heavens. And many expositors have recognized that they were going to probably build a temple high, 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 a tower high, 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 so that if the flood ever came again, they could save themselves by their own what? By their own works. And so Babylon represented man-made religion. But Babylon was also the center of image worship. And we talked about how all systems and streams of idolatry flowed from that fountainhead stream there in Babylon. So not only was it the center of image worship, not only was it the center of man-made religion, it was the center of false teachings about death. False teachings about what, everyone? Death. And we talked about this idea of the immortality of the soul and how that crept into the church through the back door. It was basically a pagan concept that was adopted by the Pharisees, that was adopted by the early church, that is to say the Catholics, and has been bequeathed as a sacred legacy to Protestantism. But the idea of innate immortality or inherent immortality is not a biblical teaching at all. In fact, it's a pagan teaching called Platonic dualism, sometimes referred to as anthropological dualism. So now we're going to discover that Babylon is also the center of sun worship. The center of what, everyone? Sun worship, and that's right there in your study guide. The Worship of Nature, Volume 1, James Brazier. This is from page 529. The retention of the old pagan name of Dies Solis, that is Sunday, right? Sunday. The retention of the old pagan name, Dies Solis, for Sunday, is in a great measure owing to the union of pagan and Christian sentiment with which the what day of the week? The first day of the week was recommended by who? Constantine to his what? Subjects, pagan and what? Christian alike, as the venerable day of the sun. So this was a politically motivated thing. Constantine basically looked out at his empire. He saw that he had a significant percentage that were Christians, a significant percentage that were pagans, and out of political expediency, he decided to try and amalgamate. What word did I say, everyone? Amalgamate, which means to combine. He tried to combine this pseudo-paganism with this pseudo-Christianity and bring it all together, and the Christians were excited about it because they thought it was evangelism. The problem is that those people that were coming into the church were not leaving their old ways at the door. They were bringing those old ways into the church. And so the people were not converted. They were simply making a profession. They were making a what, everyone? profession. In fact, that's what most historians believe about Constantine's own conversion. They believe that he didn't have anything like a conversion, most historians. They believe that Constantine's conversion was strictly a politically expedient thing to do in order to sort of bring unity to his empire. And one of the things that they did is they united the Christian Sabbath, the Sabbath of the Lord, with the venerable day of the sun, and eventually, for a time there, both days were kept, and then eventually the Sabbath day began to fall off, and Sunday receives increasing and increasing prominence. And that's exactly what's being communicated here.